Okay, what I'm going to be doing is mostly raising a question, or rather a series of questions, since it turns out there's really not a lot of work that bears really directly on the evolution of working memory. So working memory in humans has been really intensively studied over the last half century or more. An awful lot is now known. I think there's a convergence of views on its structure, its organization, its signature limits. And we know that it's really, really important for all kinds of different human activities. It's important for reasoning, it's important for text comprehension, it's important for speech comprehension, it's important for all kinds of stuff. We also know that it overlaps really heavily with fluid G, with so-called fluid general intelligence. Indeed, more than just overlapping, there's now evidence that perhaps working memory is the underlying mechanism, the cognitive basis of fluid G, and that if you train working memory, you get long-term benefits in general intelligence. So you can do interventions to actually improve general intelligence. So we know a lot about the human case. Really very little is known about the evolution of working memory in humans. There have been some speculations, mostly by anthropologists and archaeologists. But what we really need is comparative studies. And there's been a few, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but there's been no systematic effort to study working memory comparatively. So what I'm going to do is distinguish a range of possibilities, a range of claims that one, drawing on the literature in the human case, you could then pose a series of questions, all the way from no working memory at all in other animals, and I'll fairly quickly deal with that one, we know that that one's wrong, all the way to working memory hardly different from us, and the truth is probably somewhere in between, but there's really not a lot of evidence that bears on it. But before doing that, what I want to do first is distinguish working memory from two other kinds of memory with which it might get conflated, and some of the studies out in the literature are really studies of them rather than working memory. So first off, working memory versus what I'm calling sensory short-term memory. There's some inconsistency in the way terms are used. So working memory involves sustaining representations through top-down attention, right? It's the way in which you can hold representations in a global workspace to be further processed to lead to other stages. But we also know that sensory activity reverberates in the absence of attention. So there's a kind of memory there within sensory systems. That reverberation can become conscious if it's attended. So this is nice work by Stan Dehaene, that you can actually see the reverberations there in, say, temporal cortex for up to 2 seconds after a stimulus. If it's not attended, you never become conscious of it. This form of sensory short-term memory can also be used to guide online action in a way that never involves working memory or consciousness, and that's the famous Milner and Goodale work. It looks like short-term memory has something like a window of 2 seconds. So that immediately places a constraint on studies of working memory in animals, that you want to look at results that aren't going for immediate action in the absence of a stimulus, but involve sustaining a representation for longer than that kind of 2-second window. And so there are some experiments with animals that are often described as work on working memory that I think are really not that, or they may be on that, but it's hard to distinguish it from sensory short term. So in particular, there's a work by Matsuzawa and colleagues with chimpanzees, and I'm afraid this is not very clear, but this is a picture from behind of one of the chimpanzees training. What they first of all did was got the chimps to learn the sequence of numerals, 1 to 9, right? So that they could reliably, these numerals would be positioned in random positions on the screen, right? So that it's not motor memory. They've got to learn which one to press first, which one to press second, and so on. You get them to criterion to ceiling on that. They get really very good at it over trials. But then what they introduced was a memory task, that as soon as the chimp presses the number 1 here, all of the other ones are replaced by white squares. And the chimp knows that what it's got to do is press the squares where those numbers were. So here it is, making the second move, pressing where number 2 was, and then what it has to do is press this, because that's number 3, and then it needs to go up there, and so forth. Right? So it's testing the animal's memory for which numerals were where on the screen. And what you get is really quite good performance. Ayumu, who was the first to be tested like this, is getting up to 80% correct on all 9 numbers, can go through the whole sequence. When they extended it to other chimpanzees, they didn't do quite so well, but were still getting it all right at 5 or 6. But they do it very fast, at intervals around about 2 seconds for the entire sequence. So she'll often pause before pressing the first number, press it, and then if you see the videos, she goes around the other lot really very quickly. Anecdotally, the experimenters report that on some occasions she got interrupted before she had completed it. Right? So there's a fracas outside her cage, and before, having pressed the first number, she then turns away to watch it, often for a period of 20 seconds or so, and then came back and was able to complete it. Now that would be evidence of working memory, but all we've really got is a few anecdotes. So that's one distinction I want to draw. The other is between working memory and what Eriksson and Kintish called long-term working memory. Long-term working memory representations would be those that are still accessible, easy to bring back into working memory, but are no longer being sustained in working memory. Eriksson introduced it partly to explain text comprehension, where you no longer have in your active working memory the beginning or the previous sentence when you're reading the next one. But if there's a pronoun that refers back, you can quickly disambiguate it. Right? So the representation that you did construct of what that sentence meant is easily accessible to you. Or anecdotally here, I like to use the examples of the bus conductor. Some of you might be old enough to have been in London in the days when they had double-decker buses with bus conductors who came around and sold you a ticket. And it was very striking that on a crowded bus, where the bus conductor might take 5 minutes to get from the front of the ground level all the way up to the front of the top level, he would never ask someone for a ticket twice, right? That he was keeping a record of who had bought tickets and who was new, and updating that as the journey progressed. That's long-term working memory, not working memory. He wasn't continually rehearsing and refreshing what was there. So some work with animals, I think, are really studies of long-term working memory, and in particular, lots and lots of work with rats using the radial arm maze, which looks like this. So the rat gets put in the middle, there's a bit of food at the end of each of the arms, and you look to see if the rat can efficiently get round all 8 arms without repeating going into an arm. And indeed, the rats are pretty good at it. You can test them with a break, and after, say, 4, it does the first 4 correctly. You then close down the entrances to the arms, and you make it sit there for 30 seconds or 5 minutes or whatever you're testing, and then you see how well it does for the remaining 4. And this is the kind of data that you can get. You can see that after 5 minutes, the rat is still almost perfect. Okay? Doing pretty well after 20 minutes. Plain that that's not working memory. I mean, we couldn't sustain a representation for 20 minutes without sitting there going, rehearsing it continually in your mind. What it is an accessible long-term representation. Now, I should say there will be working memory involved here. It's just this isn't a test of working memory, and we can't conclude, oh, the rat has a working memory capacity of 4 items from this data. Okay, so to the questions now. The one that I'll deal with quickly This is one end of the scale of possibilities, is there's no working memory in animals at all. There's sensory short-term memory, there's long-term memory, there's nothing in between. We know that's wrong from lots and lots of studies using match to sample and non-match to sample. And I can be quick about this because Robert Clark set me up nicely for it this morning. Indeed, much of what we know about the physiology of working memory in attentional systems has come from primate work using just these kinds of tasks. A lot of it by Goldman Rakik back in the 80s and 90s. So in this kind of task, you show the animal where a target is hidden. It then gets covered up, and a screen is put down there, and you can make the animal wait for a bit, and then you pull it back up again, and it goes back to the right place. If the intervals are not too long, we can be reasonably confident it's working memory that's involved. And lo and behold, if you do single cell studies, you can find neurons in frontal cortex that maintain their activity correlated with the position of the target item. So we can be confident there's some working memory there. The next hypothesis that has been put out in the literature, not this is data that I'm going to appeal to in a minute, this is by anthropologists, is that other primates may have a much restricted working memory capacity compared to humans. The consensus now amongst humans is not the 7 plus or minus, but it's actually 3 or 4 if you control properly for rehearsal processes and chunking, the benefits of chunking information. If you are unable to chunk and unable to rehearse, the amount that you can sustain in working memory is 3 to 4 items in humans. And some have proposed, well, maybe amongst other primates, it's just much lower than that. It's maybe just 1 item or 1 or 2 items. And I think there's data that rules this out, though one could always use more data. So this is one direct study that Botnevic did using serial recall, where the monkey was successful up to 3 items, but was unable to do 4. It was a chance on 4, so we can infer on the face of it a 3-item limit. And the timescales involved were between 4 and 11 seconds, so we can be fairly confident that it's not sensory short-term memory, probably not long-term memory for that kind of short timescale. And what they found is also similar recency and primacy effects that you get in humans. So it looks like you've got something that's homologous with the human working memory system. And here is the setup. The animal had to work a joystick to move a cursor on a screen. And first of all, the central square would illuminate, and the monkey had to move the yellow square, the yellow circle into that. It was then frozen in position through the next series where random other squares went red, and that was the monkey's task to remember the sequence. It took a while to get, I think there was a 2-second, it was 0.7 of a second gap in between each of these, a 2-second gap between the last one and when it was then allowed to start moving. So the distance between this and this would be 4 seconds at least. There's then gaps in between. It wasn't allowed to go around quickly. There was a pause as soon as it had done the first one, a pause after the second one, and so on. So in order to succeed in a task like that, the monkey has to be able to keep a record of the positions of the squares that were lit up and use that information thereafter. However, one can't immediately conclude from that the monkey has a working memory limit of, well, not limit, but that it can keep 3 items in working memory in the sense in which it's involved in the human case. Because, as I said earlier, the work on the human case that has got it down to 3 to 4 is just the pure sustaining function without support from, say, motor rehearsal or chunking effects. And it may be that in this study there was support from motor rehearsal. You could imagine the animal both attempting to keep a visual spatial record of the positions and also a kind of motor plan of how it's going to move the cursor to get around the 3 items. So it might be getting the benefit from that. So, yeah, okay, I've just said that. There is, though, data that is harder to explain in these terms that wouldn't normally be discussed in a working memory context, but you can immediately see, I think, that working memory is involved. And this is tests of, it was presented as tests of small number cognition in monkeys, now horses. So the Hauser et al. Is the monkeys, Aller et al. Is horses. There's also work with 11-month-old infants to the same effect, where folks who work in the field think that, well, there's a sense in which it's not really number, it's actual object file that you're keeping. You're storing a representation of an individual object, another individual object, another individual object. And the tests involved presenting the animal with a couple of bins, and you put some food into one bin, another item of food into that bin, another item of food into that bin, say, and then into this one you just put 2, and then you let the animal choose. Is it going to go for the one that has more food in? And lo and behold, all 3 groups here do for when it's 2 versus 3, not 4 versus 6, which is the same ratio, right? So they're not just judging amount by the ratio between what's in there. They fail on 4 versus 6. Indeed, strikingly with the infants, although they can pass 2 versus 3, they fail 1 versus 4, okay? So as soon as their working memory limit is exceeded, it looks like the representation collapses completely, right? And they can't just hang on to the 3 that they saw put in there initially. Okay. That one hasn't, I think, been tested with animals. You might wonder, well, why is this showing us that the limit is 3 items rather than the limit is 5? Right? Because after all, you've got to keep track of the 2 here and the through here in order to compare them and judge that you should go for this one. Answer, because you're getting the benefit of chunking for that. Right? The 2 are chunked together in this location and the 3 are chunked together in this one, so we can only conclude here it's 3 that's the limit, and that's supported by the infant data where it collapses if just one of them goes to 4. Right? Where you can actually hold on to more total items. They can do 2 versus 3, which is 5 items, but they can't do 1 versus 4, which is also 5 items. Okay, well, within a bin, it looks like you can't get the benefit of chunking. Right? All the items are identical. They're you know, in the case of the horses, they were plastic, red-looking apples. And it looks like, at least in the horse case, it's hard to see how you could have motor rehearsal that would support performance either. Right? And in the case of the monkeys, you could maybe imagine some kind of one-to-one action rehearsal or something where you'd keep rehearsing those for the movements of putting something in. But when a horse is observing a human, it's hard to see how you'd get support. So there's tentative reason from this to believe, yeah, animals have working memory capacities that are within the normal human range. Right? The 3 to 4 limit of humans is there in horses and other primates. Okay, so third possibility is you might concede that. I mean, it's obviously still controversial after just these data, but you might say, all right, so maybe pure retention is the same across species. And what differs is that humans are much better at being able to resist interference from competing representations. Now, this is not an arbitrary suggestion in that when you do measures of humans of simple span, as it's called, right, where you just have to remember a simple sequence of items as they're going past or a simple spatial layout, that turns out not to be stable within individuals over time. Right? So how well someone does on a simple span task on one time isn't going to predict how they'll do in a month or a year. It also doesn't predict G. It doesn't correlate with other capacities. It's only so-called complex span tasks that are stable and do predict G, where you're having to do, they're in effect dual task studies, and I'll show you an example of one in a moment, where you have to be remembering one set of items at the same time as you're doing something else. So you have to resist the interference of the something else while you're hanging on to the target representation. So it's it's not unprincipled to say, well, maybe simple span is shared, and this complex span ability where you can retain some information while excluding other information, maybe that's uniquely human. And here's an example of the kind of thing they use in complex span tasks, lots of different versions of them. Your target is just to remember the sequence of letters. These would be presented sequentially. What you need to repeat at the end of it is B, N, K, J, S. Okay? But at the same time, at each presentation, you have to say yes or no to the simple arithmetic questions that are being presented alongside it. So you've got interference from figuring out the math on the one hand with holding on to your target representations on the other. So is there data that addresses this question? Turns out there is. A bunch of papers coming out of Louis Matzel's lab in Rutgers done with mice, where he used complex span tasks, or what he calls complex span tasks, using the radial arm maze, which I put up before, but where you switch the animal between mazes in sequence. Right? So you have it in one maze, you let it do 3 correct choices there, you then switch it to the other maze, and it's got to do 3 correct choices. Then you put it back to the first maze, and let it do the next 3, and then back to the next maze, and the next 3, and then back for 2, and back for 2. And what he was actually measuring was the 2s at the end. Okay? How well are they able to resist interference from memories of what they've done in this maze versus what they've done in that maze as they proceed? And what he finds is that how well you do in that task, if you're a mouse, predicts mouse G. I mean, he at the same time developed a measure of mouse G, a common factor underlying ease of learning in a range of dissimilar learning tasks for mice. And it turns out that the better you are at this task, the better you are on learning in general. It also predicts a sort of version of the mouse Stroop test, the ability to resist interference from another representation. This is kind of interesting. What he did was, first of all, get them to learn 2 separate discrimination tasks. One was to learn a target shape amongst other shapes, learned in one context, right? Say a particular region of the room. Another was an odor discrimination task, where they had to learn to pick out one odor against a background of other odors. Test was then to present them with both odors and shapes, but in the context where shape is what they had to do to get the reward, or in the context where odor is what they had to do in order to get the reward. So they have to ignore the odors when they're in the shape context, even though they've already been trained on discriminating the odors, and just focus on the shape and vice versa. And it turns out that how well you do on this task predicts how well they're doing on this one too, which is quite close to what we know about working memory, where it's the capacity to direct attention and to suppress representations that aren't relevant, are crucial to working memory activities in humans. Also striking, he was able to show that complex span training improves both this discrimination task, the kind of Stroop test, and G in mice. So he developed a version of the complex switching task, where in one case, both of the radial arm mazes were in the same room, so the spatial cues that you'd have to encode and pull up would be subtly different from one another, right? In order to discriminate one radial arm from another, you have to think, well, this is the one that's on the end where this thing is, and so forth. So the differences would be subtle, you have to pay attention, versus a complex span task where you're in separate rooms, where it's much easier, though still difficult, and found that in both cases, you've got the biggest, if you train, the ones trained up on the complex span in the same room showed the greatest improvements in mouse G and Stroop test thereafter. So it looks like mouse working memory and human working memory at least have similar structures. They're both involving attention, the capacity to ignore irrelevant information and suppress irrelevant information. Both have a similar connection to general learning abilities. Okay. Whether, though, humans are better at resisting interference, I mean, one might predict that. I mean, we're famously it's supposed to be executive function that's supposed to be so good in humans, but there have been no direct tests using matched tasks that you put to humans and animals to see how well they do. Okay, so working memory is often said to involve a number of functions. Sustaining representations, that's what we've been talking to up to now, but also rehearsing and manipulating. I'll come on to manipulating later. So another possibility might be, well, maybe this stuff is homologous between humans and other animals, but maybe other animals can't rehearse representations in working memory. Where I think in the human case, what underlies that ability is offline activation of motor schemata. And we know, I think, a fair bit now about how the thing works. Whenever motor instructions are generated, you get an efference copy of those instructions that's used to build a so-called forward model, which is a sensory model of the way the action should unfold, and that can be compared, in the case where there's real action, with the results online to improve and update your action. In offline motor rehearsal, you just suppress the actual instructions to the muscles, but you use the efference copy of the initial activated motor schemata to generate a forward model. If attended to, it can enter working memory and be conscious. So working memory will be of images of actions and consequences. In the human case, Damasio and others' work suggests this is the basis of prospection and planning, that what you do is rehearse some action that's open to you that generates proprioceptive or visual representations of the execution of that action in an imagined context. You respond affectively to what you're imagining, and that serves as the basis for selecting it or not selecting it. Well, do we then have evidence of planning that in the human case would be realized in that way in apes? Answer, yes. Also in corvids, who are much more evolutionarily distant. Now, there's going to be an argument by analogy here, which is comparatively weak, stronger for the apes than the corvids, obviously, that if something is done by offline rehearsal in the human case and you get similar planning behavior in another creature, then they're probably doing it the same way. Similar behavior gives you an inference to similar underlying mechanisms. Well, that gives you some reason to believe that, but it's weak. It would be much better to have direct tests, but that we don't have at the moment. But here's quickly just some of the experiments that have been done with apes. This is Markachi and Kaur, where, look at the last one first. This is the apparatus that the ape is going to be presented with. It's had previous experience with this. It has to poke a tube through the little hole in the plexiglass to break this support so that bunches of grapes will drop down to where the animal can access them. Right? But the test is, it's not allowed to do that at this point. It's got a bunch of tools that it could select. Does the ape select the appropriate tool to take away into another room, keep there for a delay period, remember to bring back later? And they did this with the first experiment. It had sight of the apparatus while it was in this other room during the delay period. The next experiment was overnight in separate sleeping quarters where it couldn't see anything at all, and got positive results in these. In a rather nice replication, same set of experiments, it was a different thing. It was pulling a hook towards it that it had to do to get a drink. Again, similar findings. In a conceptual replication of those results by Osvath and Osvath, I mean, using different materials and methods, the apes were able to select a tool to use for an out-of-sight apparatus that was out of sight at the point of selection, for use 70 minutes later, quite a lot of success. The failures mostly resulted from, because the apes were let back into the main area, it mostly resulted from infants stealing the tool or breaking it or something of that kind, rather than the animal losing track of what it was supposed to be doing. In the second experiment in this, the ape was presented with a choice, grape now or juice later. Now the juice is highly prized, there was a lot more of it. Many were able to resist the grape and took the tool, although it wouldn't be able to use the tool for some hours before it would get the juice. Now, humans doing that kind of test, you'd use mental rehearsal, at least if we believe the Damasio-style literature. You'd be using your pleasure reaction at the imagined future drinking to outweigh your current desire for the grape. And if the argument from analogy has any strength at all, that's some reason to think the apes are doing something similar. In the final experiment they did here, they had them selecting amongst novel tools, again out of sight of the apparatus, with high success, where it was various tube-like things that it would need to get into the drinking box, but tube-like things that it had never seen before. Okay. Now, again, human solving that, you'd do something like pre-experience the use of actions involving those tools. You'd imagine yourself sucking out of this tube-like thing or inserting it into the hole, seeing it would fit, and sucking it. Again, some sort of argument from analogy that maybe the apes are doing the same. But it would be great to have something more direct. Okay, so remember, working memory, we've got sustain, rehearse. There's also manipulation, is talked about in the human literature. What it involves is actively transforming a working memory image or a working memory representation. So you've got something there in working memory, you do something with it. Been heavily studied in humans using the visual rotation paradigm, where you have a shape that's presented, you have to judge whether it is the same shape as another shape over here that's at a different orientation, and the finding is that people, they manipulate that first shape, they flip it over, say, or they swivel it around in imagination to see whether it will fit. And we know that in the human case, rotation is both preceded by and caused by motor activity. That it looks like generating motor schemata, as it were, to twist the thing with your hand, is what generates the change in the visual representation of the thing that you're looking at. So it is literally, or almost literally, manipulation of a visual image. And one of the classic findings is longer rotations have longer reaction times, right? So if you have to rotate something through 180 degrees, it takes you twice as long to reach a judgment that, yes, it's the same, as if you only have to rotate it through 90 degrees. Okay. Well, we have evidence of just that in a couple of old papers in both baboons and sea lions, where faced with just that problem, judge whether this shape fits that shape, you got the signature from the human case of larger rotations take longer reaction times. And that's the only bit of evidence here. We don't have evidence that motor cortex was active and involved or anything of that kind. But you might draw similar inferences from some of the recent insight experiments with chimpanzees, where you'd think, well, they have to be manipulating a representation in order to get a solution to this problem. In particular, some apes pass the so-called floating peanut task, where the problem that they're presented with is a glass tube that's attached to the bar of a cage with a peanut sitting at the bottom, too deep for them to reach. They can't get their hands down in there. Nothing else available they can use, except there's a bucket of water sitting in the corner. Okay? And some of them hit on the solution to go and suck up a mouthful of water, spit it in there, go and get another one, spit it in until the peanut floats to the top. One ape got impatient and urinated into there, which worked just as well. Okay. Indeed, they did comparable studies here with apes and children, and the rates of passing amongst the apes are about the same as that of the 4 to 6 year old children, not quite so good as the 8-year-old children. Now, if you think what you have to do to pass that task, it looks like you have to imagine putting liquid in the glass, imagine the peanut rising. So this is now the manipulation of your representation of where the peanut is in the glass, right? And then predict that iteration will bring it within reach. Right? I think similarly, you can give the same interpretation to the classic Curler's apes experiments with the boxes and the bananas, right, where you have the banana hanging up there and the boxes that you have to rearrange. That humans solving that task would muddle about with representations of the boxes until you hit on a solution. Okay, so tentative reasons to think that maybe for all the various functions of working memory, those are shared by other species of primate, at least. You might say, well, and this would be a sort of weaker position still, well, maybe what's really different about humans is that we make chronic use of working memory. We're using it all the time. And this is recent work on the default network and mind wandering in particular. Right? So whenever humans aren't actively engaged on some overt task, your working memory will be filled with recalling past episodes of something or other, or imagining a future one, or you'll be rehearsing a conversation, or you'll be fantasizing about your next summer vacation, or whatever. Right? There's always content there in working memory being generated and manipulated, and so on. Maybe animal working memory is purely task-oriented. Maybe only when you present it with some problem to be solved or something to get does working memory get employed. A very indirect reason for thinking that might be true is that it would at least be consistent with vastly greater creativity in human cognition and innovation, and much greater use of long-term planning. We now have evidence, and this is the paper cited at the top, that those who mind wander tend to be more creative, that you set up experimental situations where some are encouraged to mind wander and some are not. The ones who are mind wandering do better. And you might think that a benefit of continually running stuff through your working memory when you're offline is, in a relaxed mode, you can be trying out all kinds of different possibilities, and sometimes you hit upon really good ones, which you can then implement. Well, is there any evidence that bears on this? Well, one bit of evidence is the finding that there is a default network in chimps, and this is the Rilling paper at the top. They did the experiment by injecting radioactive materials, low-level radioactive materials, into both humans and chimps, letting them then sit for 30 minutes, and then see where you got the greatest uptake in the brain of those radioactive materials. So that the chimps were then scanned under anesthetic at the end. The humans just went into a normal scanner. But what was being measured was what had taken place over the previous 30 minutes. And what they find was more or less homologous default networks lighting up across both sets of species. So one conclusion you might draw from that is, oh, okay, so maybe the chimpanzees, when they sit there quietly, are likewise ruminating and running over possibilities and so forth, just as humans are. But a reason to be cautious about that is that you also get default network showing up in monkeys and rats under anesthesia. Right? So even when they're unconscious and just background noise I mean, of course, brain cells are still firing off and so forth. Things never totally close down, but no consciousness. You've still got default network brain areas showing up. And what seems to be going on is, well, first of all, what we can conclude is default network activity by itself isn't evidence of working memory involvement, okay? Because working memory is almost by definition, conscious. Rather, what the default network may be is something like neural connector hubs. So just as airports that serve as connectors have more traffic through them, so hubs in the brain, and in particular medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, seem to serve as similar kinds of hubs. So even with low-level background neural noise, there'll be more activity showing up in those, just as a result of that they're more connected than other areas are. Okay, final possibility to say something about briefly is, and this one I think we can be confident about, much of what's happened in the interval here can't. Humans and other animals certainly differ in the things that you can rehearse in working memory, right? And that's speech actions, right? So other animals will be able to rehearse bodily actions of various sorts, rehearse making noises, but of course not rehearse speech in so-called inner speech. Those rehearsals, we know, play an important role in so-called system 2 reasoning, reflective reasoning of the sort that folks like Danny Kahneman study. When you stop and pause and think and work your way through a solution, it's not all in inner speech, but inner speech plays an important role often. So you might think, okay, so one way in which we differ from animals is nothing about what the working memory system is simply it differs in the contents that you can put through it. It differs from the kinds of actions that you can rehearse. And we know that system 2, by the way, is both working memory dependent and correlates with fluid G. Okay, so what you can conclude from that is, so language at least vastly, even if other primates make chronic use of working memory, when you add in a language system, it kind of vastly extends your powers of reflection. There's then many more things you can ruminate about because you've got this other action system that you can then use for doing it. And you might also think that having a larger conceptual repertoire, partly as a result of having language, would give you more flexible strategies for working memory chunking and so forth. Okay, so nearly done. One thing you can conclude, I think, is that animals, apes and primates, maybe all mammals, maybe corvids, though here the argument for homology is much weaker, have working memory capacities that are in many respects like us. Now, that's the area of controversy. We've had very little direct comparative work. You can conclude that something is homologous, but exactly what the homologies are and how close the systems are across species is very much up in the air. Maybe we use working memory more in making chronic use of it. I think we don't have data on that yet. The default network data isn't providing that data. We certainly use it in ways that other animals can't, namely in inner speech, right? That's the other end of the scale here. But much of the evidence I've reviewed is indirect. Right? It relied on arguments from analogy and so forth. This is really a call to those of you who are working as comparative psychologists, go out, do some work, find out. Right? What we really need is more studies to see to what extent this crucial human ability is uniquely human, to what extent it isn't, and what the commonalities and differences are. Okay, thanks.